Welcome to the Parenting Coach Podcast with Crystal. Over 7 years ago, I felt like I was stuck in this cycle of yelling and reactivity in my parenting that I did not want to be in, but I didn't know how to get out of. I knew how I wanted to parent pretty much exactly, and I'd spent hours reading books, but not finding a way to show up how I wanted to. That's when I started to turn inwards. My own inward journey was what my family needed. As I changed, everything around me changed. My kids' meltdowns decreased by 90% or more with no medications or therapy. I stopped yelling, sibling fighting became almost entirely non-existent, and I found that this change flowed into other areas of my life too. My intuition increased. I started to run my life and business in a very different way. If this sounds like something you want to, I can help. Join me each week as I share my journey, including the laughter, fun, hard times, and tears. Tune in for support, guidance, and fun conversations with my favorite experts, and really anything else that interests me too. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Parenting Coach Podcast. This week, we have a guest interview. I hope you were able to listen to the last couple of episodes. They were so fun. And I've loved just kind of having this be kind of the culmination of all the things that I want to make sure that I mention and talk to you about before we end the podcast at the end of this season. And today is no different. It's going to be a great conversation with a topic that I've never brought to the podcast before, but I think is really important. And so I would like to introduce Dr. Lisa Orbé-Austin. I said that right? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Right.
Okay. I will have you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and also your husband, because you work from home with your husband, just like I do. So fun. Tell us a little bit about what you guys do and kind of how you got into doing this.
Yeah. So my husband and I are both psychologists. We're counseling psychologists. So one of the things that differentiates counseling psychologists from clinical psychologists is that we have like a history and a training in career development. We're the branch of psychology that really helped veterans adjust back to life after World War II and kind of retrain themselves to do other things. So our branch of psychology did that. So we also do career and executive coaching on top of being psychologists, and are experts in the field of imposter syndrome. And we became sort of that like accidentally because it was something I had experienced throughout my life and had a really, really terrible work experience that really led me to want to write about imposter syndrome and talk about my own experiences. And then my editor found me and had me write our first book, which is called Own Your Greatness, about dealing with imposter syndrome internally. And this is our third book. The third book largely was focused on how to intervene on it with children because it starts largely in childhood. So we were much more in the preventative lens when we wrote this book. But that's sort of how we arrived at this sort of accidentally.
Hey, I love it because I think that the most interesting stories are always the one that actually are us. It's not just like, I always thought, I remember when I first heard about Brené Brown years ago, and I was just like, oh, it's because she's like researched so much about shame. But then you read her books and she's like, it's actually because I deal with shame so much myself that I'm like, have gotten so good at it. And I think that's true about all the things. It's like the actual personal experiences we have. How did you and your husband meet? You're both counseling psychologists. Did you meet in school or something?
Yes and no. I think we interacted first while we were graduate students. I was at Columbia and he was at Fordham. And so I ran a conference that was very popular for grad students, and he and I interacted in those plays, but we didn't really know each other. And then one year I actually got a new job working in like a college counseling career center. It was a career counseling center, and he was already working there. And we met. Actually, we didn't get along at all at first. When I was introduced to him, he just was like, "Hi," and then he walked back into his office, and I was like, "That's just so rude." And we probably didn't get along for the first couple of months because I ended up on a project that we were collaborating on, and I was told to kind of like supervise him, but we were the same level, and he really didn't take too kindly to that. And so, in working through that conflict, is how we became friends. And then later on, we ended up randomly applying to the same internship. And for PhD programs, it's like the medical school match. So it's like a computer that puts you together after you interview all these places. And we ended up at the same internship match, which was kind of random because he never planned to be at a hospital and I never planned to be at that hospital. And so it was a sort of a random connection there too. And then we just became really good friends and then, found a connection together. We're like very complementary. We ended up being running groups together, getting supervised together, doing a lot of things together, and realized we just have a really good like rhythm together. And so that's
You're
how
like,
it all
might as well be
started.
partners for life.
Yes.
We work well together. I
We
love that it
do.
started out like that too. I met my husband in junior high, but by high school, I think I was like 16 or 15 when I first asked him on a date, and he just said no and walked away. And I was like, rude. I read my journal from those entries, and it was like, I'm not going to have a crush on him anymore. I'm going to like his best friend or something very 16-year-old-esque of me. And anyways, over time, I realized he actually just had like a lot of anxiety around talking to women. And anyways, it was all his own thing, like it always is. It's never actually about us. It worked out in the end.
Yes, clearly. That's
So
awesome.
I would love to dig into imposter syndrome. And first of all, I kind of thought it was something everybody knew about, but as I've talked to some people, they're like, what? I don't know what you're talking about. So first of all, will you just kind of define for people that haven't heard that before, what is imposter syndrome?
Sure. So imposter syndrome is the experience when you are qualified, competent, experienced, skilled, credentialed, but you haven't internalized that. And as a result of not internalizing that, you tend to fear that you are a fraud. And so then anytime you make a mistake or have a failure, you think it's exposure of this fraudulence. And as a result, you're trying to cover up this perceived fraudulence by either overworking or self-sabotaging. And so oftentimes we are very perfectionistic, tend to overestimate others' skills compared to our own. We tend to look for a lot of external validation in order to feel like we're worthy. We can get caught up in really toxic work dynamics because we can take and put up with a lot because we're just trying to prove ourselves. So there's a lot of really negative kind of impact to career, self-esteem, all kinds of things related to this experience. It's really common. It's about between 70 and 82% of people experience it. There's like a new study that says 82% of people experience it. And so it's a pretty common phenomenon, and it's not a diagnosis. It's referred to as imposter syndrome, but in the academic literature, it's known as imposter phenomenon. It's not a diagnosis. You can't get diagnosed with it. It's just an experience that a lot of people have.
I'm curious about that because I think I watched a Reels where you said like, it's 70 to 82% or whatever. Not everybody has it. I kind of just presumed it was something that everybody dealt with because everybody that I've talked to does. Do you find that it's more common if you're like more highly educated versus less? Or do you think that just everybody kind of feels it? Like what makes that happen?
Yeah, so I'm largely a lot of experiences in childhood is what drives it. And that's why we wrote this book, is because we wanted to make it a preventative book so that we don't have as many people experiencing it later on in life. But what I think a lot of people think is that everyone has it, or a lot of internally people feel like nobody else has it. And I'm very strange and this is very odd. And so while we do see it a lot in successful people, because that's the overwork cycle of imposter syndrome, we also see it in people who are like kind of like failing to achieve their potential because they're more the self-sabotage cycle of things. So they get in their own ways a lot more. So it can be either or. So highly successful outwardly, or people who had a lot of potential that weren't able to be successful. They're just so different cycles.
Because I remember I was at a coaching conference with the program that I took every year. We get together at this conference. There's like thousands of people there. And this lady was kind of talking about the same kind of phenomenon. She didn't call it this, but she just said, in one way, we kind of self-sabotage ourselves by procrastinating and not getting anything done and kind of like freezing. And in the other, we like really overwork and get a lot done. And so everybody around me kind of looked at me and they were like, well, why are you so successful? Like they kept using that term. And I'm like, what makes like, I'm not successful. Like in my mind, I was like, but I'm not. And everybody else was like, but you are. And I was like, oh, it's because I have that kind of a brain where I'm constantly overworking. I was getting all these extra certifications, but only because I didn't feel like it was already enough. I was like, let me get certified by 5 different companies. And then I'll finally feel like I know enough. Because I didn't recognize at that time that it was actually this thing. And I think my brain always goes to overworking. It doesn't do the freeze procrastination. It's like, let's just do like way more.
It does the fight instead of freeze.
Yes.
Yeah. So that overwork cycle is more a combination of like fight and fawn. And the self-sabotage is more a combination of like freeze. So it's much more a freeze kind of like experience.
Yeah. I'm curious for you too. Like, what do you think it is that like 70 to 82% or whatever ish? Why did the other 18% not have it. Also, I would say my husband is probably this, because whenever I talk to him about like what I'm dealing with in my clients and what we're working through, he like often does not resonate with it. He's just like, but I just like, I asked him one time before he went into a job interview, I'm like, what do you do to prepare? And he's like, I just have a conversation with myself and I just like pump myself up and I'm like, you're really awesome. Like you're totally, and I'm like, you what? You like, this was years ago. This is before I was into all of this kind of self-help stuff. And I was like, you just naturally like tell yourself how cool you are before you go in so you can feel good about yourself in an interview. Anyways, it kind of blew my mind because I think I do the opposite. I'm like,
Yeah.
ooh, but what if they like find out that like, I'm not actually as good as I'm saying that I am. Maybe I should check all those things off my resume before I,
Yes.
go in. So, what does the other 20% ish have?
Yeah.
That
And
makes
so I
them
do
that way?
think it's a childhood experience oftentimes. Oftentimes they were either raised or understood their raising in a very different way than we did. And so for like my husband is also similar to your husband in the fact that he's really never experienced it and always felt smart, always felt capable, always felt like he could do what he expected that he could do. And his sister's kind of probably the same. And so I just think they had a very different experience as children. And so for a lot of people who grow up with imposter syndrome, they grow up with some familiar child dynamics. So they often grow up in homes where they have to please or kind of make sure that everyone's happy with their performance in order to kind of be valued. They often grow up in environments where conflict is not very well managed in the family. And so they tend to be afraid of dealing with that and want to be just pleasing to and just quiet down some of the difficult dynamics. Tend to grow up in families with a lot of rigid rules and expectations, really difficulty kind of seeing people in complex ways, seeing them very singularly. You are this or you are that. You are not this and that and that and that. So there are a lot of dynamics that are going on, the ways that they internalize success, the ways they deal with failure. All of these things are kind of what shape us into this pathway. And as you can see, if 70 to 82% of people are experiencing it, this is probably more familiar, the parenting pattern, than the ones in that 20 to 30% other pattern where people don't have it. And look, there's another pattern, what I say is what comprises that 20 to 30% are people who have never had it and don't experience it, didn't have the experiences early on around their own successes and achievements. There's a part of people who've recovered from it, who can actually recover from it and move beyond it. And then there's a part that have the opposite, which is called Dunning-Kruger, which is that they believe they're an expert when they're not. And so there's a lot that comprise that 30%.
One's fascinating. I've never heard of that. What percentage would that be?
That's not been fully studied, but that's what I believe is in that 30%, is that there are people who never, people who have recovered, and then people who have an opposite experience where they believe they're an expert when they're really not. And so I think we don't know the numbers, but that's what I think it comprises of. And so like, I think it's important to recognize, one, you can overcome it. Two, like not everyone has the same childhood experiences. And three, there are other experiences to be had where you're not insecure at all.
Totally. And when you were talking about your husband, I was thinking about my husband's sister also. She lives in New York and she became like a fashion designer, an architect, and she like has literally achieved all of her dreams. And I asked her one time as we were visiting, I was just like, how do you think that happened? Like nobody, like, I think when she was 14, she took a fashion design class at our local high school and was like, I'm going to do this. Like, I'm going to make it. And she just always believed in herself. And I asked her and she's like, my mom always just raised us with this belief of like, you can actually do anything you want. And she's like, and I believed her because she just really believed it. And my husband was like, I think that is what it is. Like, I think we just both really grew up under this belief of like, you can do anything you want. And I was just like, wow, like that really made such a significant impact for them.
Totally. And I see the same thing in my husband's family too, where his parents were immigrants from a foreign country, didn't come here speaking English, didn't have college educations, yet they raised an MD and a PhD. They have two children. One's an MD, the other one's a PhD.
Wow.
Both went to like elite schools, full scholarships. Like it's pretty crazy. And I think it's really about the kind of parenting that they did. That made the difference.
Yeah. And I think you can achieve that from the opposite kind of parenting where you're just like, you must do this. And you like kind of force them and have the rigid control for sure.
But I love it is lying all of this.
Yes. But I love the idea of like, you can actually foster this like trust and belief and connection with them. Okay. So this totally lines up with everything I talk about in parenting, which is awesome. But before we dig into the preventative measures, I would love to just hear a little bit about your own story with it.
Yes,
Tell me about yours.
So I experienced it throughout my entire life. I don't really recall a moment in my own life, my own education, my own professional life where I didn't feel like I wasn't good enough, that I was hiding, that I didn't belong. And so, that I did, did belong. I never felt that way. And even throughout, even when I got into a PhD program at an Ivy League university, I still felt like I was hiding and they were going to catch me. So I spent a lot of my educational experience and work experience always trying to prove myself, always trying to be recognized as worthy. But it led me to cycles and cycles of burnout. I just was in one cycle of burnout, I'd recover enough to get back to burning myself out and then do it all over again. It was really tough. And then I finished my PhD program, still very insecure. So I finished my PhD program. I had my PhD from Ivy League University. And I used to have like these nightmares that I would get a phone call saying they found some error or some issue in my dissertation and they were going to take my PhD from me. For years, I feared every like call from the university. Mostly they were just looking for money. But I thought it was someone calling, to kind of take it all away from me. And it was just a really scary feeling. I ended up in a job afterwards that really wasn't, it wasn't the caliber of job I should have had at that particular point in my life. And I just took it because somebody offered it to me. And I ended up with a really toxic boss. And he was pretty terrible. And he would humiliate me in public. He would undermine anything I said. It was really difficult because I was working in a university teaching faculty how to teach. And there's probably nothing scarier than doing that when you're an administrator. And so because they challenge you because they think that they're great teachers, but we happen to know that they're struggling and we're trying to provide them with intervention. So it was really difficult to watch him do this to me consistently because then I had people who were questioning me when he wasn't around and everything I came out of my mouth was being challenged. It was so hard to do the job. I ended up finding my coworker was making 50% more than me. We had the same, actually, I had one more program than she had. He wouldn't change the pay, so it was a really tough time and he was terribly abusive. And I couldn't leave the job. I just felt nobody else would want me. I felt like, I couldn't go anywhere else. I really felt trapped. And even though people were telling me you should quit the job, you should move on, I couldn't do it. I couldn't start job searching, nothing. And so, as I've been putting up with it for months and we walked into a senior staff meeting, it was all women in the senior staff meeting. And there was music playing in the background. And somebody asked, what's this music that's playing in the background? And he said, it's music to soothe the savage breast. And in that like one moment, it became clear to me that he knew exactly what he was doing. And he knew that we were all sitting there trying to please him and trying to, trying to get to a place with him. And it was just scary. And I just was like, I don't want to put myself in a circumstance where someone's abusing me on purpose and knows what they're doing. It's not an accident. I'm not poorly performing. He just really just wants to subjugate me here. So I went back into my office. I told my husband I was going to quit. I came back that weekend and cleared out my office. So I would not go back. I was very afraid that I would try to like not quit the job. So I cleared out my office, cleared out my computer. And on Monday morning, walked in with my keys to his office, to my office. And I walked in his office and gave them to him. And at first he like cried and said my money was encumbered, which meant in grant terms that it was meant for my salary only and he couldn't use it for anything else. And then when he realized that wouldn't make me budge, he then threatened me, said I would never work in education again, that I would never find another job. But yet I knew I couldn't go back to my office because it was completely cleared out. And so I just, gave my keys. And I remember walking out of that office like it was yesterday. I could hear like the clicking of my heels on the linoleum floor and just feeling like this really intense panic. And I went home. I don't remember the ride home. I was just probably in some kind of like haze, but I had a panic attack when I got home, feeling like I had just messed up everything I put my effort toward had just been like wiped in one like fell swoop. And I called my husband, he was at work and he said, just start working on the things that you haven't been focusing on in your life. He's like, start working on your practice, get your licensing exam, get all of it done, the things that you've been pushing aside for all this time. And so I created a study schedule, started working on my licensing exam and started working on the administration to start up a practice. And then I got a job within 2 weeks in education, making a little bit more than I was making it at that place and working only like 2 days a week. And, then I worked on building my practice and then my practice is what brought me to this moment. But it was just a really terrible experience because all I ever felt was afraid,
Do you feel like racism or sexism was part of how he treated you? Like, do you feel like there was more to it than just like I'm a mean person that abuses people?
I mean, I definitely think for him particularly, sexism was a part because we were all women. It was like a senior staff of like 7 women. There were no men on the senior staff, and he just really did subjugate us all. It wasn't like that. It was particular to me. It was like particular to all of us. So I do think there's a woman dynamic. But in the past, I had a lot of terrible bosses, and sometimes there was a racial dynamic. And so all of these things can interplay with it all. But most importantly was my own belief about myself, right? Because the racism can happen. Because Richard and I talk about this all the time. And he said he's experienced a lot of racism in his experience of work, but he never believes it. He never believes it makes him less than he never believes that it's because he's not as smart. He doesn't ever take it in. Where I would take it in, I would be like, well, maybe I was a diversity hire. Maybe I don't belong here. And I would have all these narratives about like, maybe they were right. But Richard never believed them as right. And so like, that's the difference for us is like, that can still exist, but he doesn't believe it where I had in the past believed it.
That never even occurred to me that like that racism piece with the self-belief part. And that's such a beautiful like difference also like that he's like, I can be in this situation and not take it on. How did you change that personally? Cause like you left because you saw like yourself and your self-belief and that it was such a harmful environment. But how did you do the internal work to shift that?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, because that's what drove me to write the first book, which is that I didn't have a guidebook of how to handle this. One of the things I talk about a lot is that the sadness about it not being a diagnosis is that there is no drive, there is no money behind funding kind of the interventions that change it. And so it has taken a long time in the research literature, taken over 40 years for us to get to the place where we can begin to look at this because there hasn't been a driving force to kind of treat it. So I couldn't go to a therapist to deal with it because none of them were specializing in this or none of them they just thought it was self-esteem issues. And it's far more than that. And so like, I just really started working on, living as if, like I really didn't believe that I could do these things, but I just started to be like, okay, well, I'm going to try and see if I can be in my own practice. I'm going to try to see if I can do this. And look, if the worst thing that'll happen is I'll stay in the same position I'm in today. And my husband, we talk about this in the first book about having an imposter syndrome expert. And he really was mine. And he was always pushing me to do more, pushing me to be the things I wanted to be. And so he was very confident in me in a way where I couldn't be. And I just trusted that he was right. And he was right. And so, it was just really a belief that he wouldn't lie to me and he wouldn't tell me something that wasn't true. I just had to believe him over believing the narrative going on inside of myself.
Oh, I love that idea. And I talk about this in parenting, but also I think that's kind of what we do as healers or psychologists or coaches or whatever, is that like, we're able to help people borrow a belief that maybe they don't have in themselves yet. Yeah. And I think that's like such a beautiful dynamic that you're able to have that with your husband.
Yeah.
That's so awesome.
He used to say something to me that I never got in the beginning, but once I got it was profound to me, which is he used to say, when you start working for yourself like you do for others, you're going to be unstoppable. When you work as hard for yourself as you do for others, you're going to be unstoppable. And I never knew how to work hard for myself. I knew how to work hard when somebody else needed something, but I didn't know how to work hard when I needed something or I wanted something. So it was really about transforming that energy that I was spending pleasing other people and start to do it to please myself, to do the things I wanted for my own life.
Where do you feel like you're at with it now? Now that you've like had some years, I don't know how many years that was, of kind of like transitioning and borrowing his belief and kind of leaning into it. Where do you feel like you are now?
I mean, I think I'm in a place where it's pretty conquered. It's not that I suggest that I don't get triggered and I don't have flare-ups, but I'm really good at using my resources and my skills and my tools to get where I need to get faster than I used to be. Like, as you can see, I was telling the story about leaving that job. It took me I think 9 months for me to leave that job. Now, if I get triggered in the matter of less than 24 hours, I can reduce the feelings around it, pretty quickly. And so I don't let it guide my behavior anymore. Before, it guided my behavior almost completely. And now it doesn't really guide my behavior. I take the risks. I see what's out there. I'm much more free to kind of live in the life I want and take the risks that I feel like I want to make, which I didn't before.
I also love that you saw that it was lacking Like, I feel like those are the best books. It's like, wait a second, like this is missing in this sphere. Like, why is this message not being spread? And then you became like your own expert from your own experience. And then we're able to really dig into and share it. And I think it's a really cool dynamic too, to have you and your husband, because your husband kind of grew up in this other environment where he didn't really feel it. And for him to be able to be that person for you. So this is all just such a cool story. I would love to also dig into this idea of preventative. So how can we become the kind of parents that help our kids be that 20 to 30%? And also hopefully my goal would be to like increase that, right?
Yeah,
like how can we
exactly.
create a whole entire generation of people that don't have to deal with this?
Yeah. And I think a lot of the things you have talked about have been sort of central to that, which is that, it's sort of really reducing the experience of shame in parenting and really being able to look at the way that you're parenting and really think about the impact of that parenting long term. And so I think a lot of times, parents parent in fear. If I don't do this, they're going to fail. If I don't give them that particular, extracurricular, extra tutoring or this or that, it's going to destroy their chances for whatever. And I think it's, parenting in a lot more consciousness and confidence that your connection with them is more vital than anything they might achieve through, kind of being really, really tough on them or being really rigid on them. And I do think that has been like the general philosophy of the book is like to be kind on yourself as a parent so that you can be kind on your child as they develop, because developing is hard. And so I do think like a lot of it is really focused on some of the key issues that we see in early development that impact a kid's belief that they're not good enough, that they're not capable, that they're a fraud, that they have to overwork.
I love that idea too of like that it starts with us. That's what I talk about literally every single podcast episode. It's like we have to give it to us first if we want to give it to our kids.
Totally.
And sometimes I felt like it was too late for my kids. Like my two older kids had a very different parenting experience than my two younger kids are having. And our spread is kind of large. So like my 18-year-old had a very different mother for the first 12 years than my 8-year-old now has. And so I often tell them like, yeah, there's probably going to be some stuff that you're going to have to work through. But a cool story that I was thinking of as you were talking was my 15-year-old decided that he wanted to join musical theater this year. We've never done anything music-y before. My family was musical, but I didn't really pass that down. We didn't really sing as a family or anything. So in my mind, I'm kind of like, I don't think you can just jump into it in like, can't just join the senior academy. Anyways, I messaged them and they're like, no, we take everybody. It's fine. So he gets in there, he lands a lead role, which I was like, we were all shocked by. I was like, did they hear you sing? Do you even know how to sing? Didn't even know if he did. Anyway, so I get him a vocal coach and he's working through with his vocal coach. His vocal coach is like, he should join music festival. I'm like, but he's never really done this before. Anyway, so I asked him how he's feeling about it. And he said, I want to do it because I want to see if I experience stage fright. He's like, so far, nothing has made me uncomfortable. I just go and do it. And he's like, so I kind of think maybe like, this sounds kind of scary. Maybe it would actually be scary. And I was like, you've never experienced stage fright? Like, and it went back to all the moments in my childhood where my parents forced me to music festival every year of my entire childhood, which is why I did not pass it down. And I just hated it every time. And it was such a cool way to see like, okay, maybe some of this, what I've been changing in parenting, even though I started so late with him, has really landed because he tried something totally new, way off, like in the sidelines of something he's ever tried before, felt confident in it and felt confident enough that he was like, I'm going to go, I'm going to audition.
I know he's seeking fear, which I think is the coolest thing ever.
Right?
That he's like seeking to be afraid. He's like, how far can this go? Let's see how far.
Yeah, maybe I won't ever feel this way. Anyway, so it's been a cool thing to see. So for people that are listening, they're like, oh, well, I did it wrong with my kids. I definitely felt that way. And I remember hearing my very first parenting conference years and years ago, one of the questions was like, is it too late for me? Like, is it too late to change this kind of parenting? And I think it was Dr. Tina Payne Bryson actually. And she was like, it's never too late. And I just cried because at that moment, that's what I needed to hear was like, it is never too late. And that has been my experience of like, it doesn't matter if you're listening to this and you have an adult child, like you can change your relationship at any point.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most profound experiences that led to writing this book was I was giving a talk to a bunch of leaders at an organization about imposter syndrome. And one of the women was like, I talked about this frame that I have, which is there's no such thing as lazy. That I believe that in essence, when someone's termed as lazy, there's something else going on that you're missing. And it could be neurodivergence. It could be, some kind of depression. It could be a variety of things, but you should be curious as to what the laziness is about. And it really hit her really hard. And she said, so I did the talk, and at the end, she, I guess, called her son and started talking to him about what he was struggling with. He was in college and what he was struggling with, because he was having a lot of problems in college, wanted to drop out. She was very scared for him. And he started telling her that he was dealing with anxiety and depression and having trouble in school. And she was like, I want to help you. And he said it was the first time he felt like she could help him. And it was a really lovely moment. And as I was getting on the elevator to leave, she stopped me and she was like, I just want to thank you. And she told me the story about talking to him. She's like, it really just changed my mind to think about, that it's not done yet. I still get to be a part of his life and help him through this next phase. And I'm seeing him differently now already. And it was just such a beautiful thing. And I was like, I think we need more of this, more like rethinking of the way that we, think about our kids, ourselves as parents, and like
especially
the
that lazy,
that
like that phrase you just said. So true. My kid and I were just having a conversation about lazy. And I was like, I even said to him, like, I don't know if there is lazy. Like, I don't know if that exists.
Yeah.
And I love that you just said that, because that feels so aligned with the conversations we've been having in our house lately. Okay. So if somebody's listening to this podcast and they're like, okay, I'm at this stage where I'm really like trying to help my kids through, I'm trying to be this preventative parent. Is there any tips that you would give them right now of things that they can kind of work on to help foster the environment that you talk about in your book?
I mean, I think there's a lot of things in the book. We talk about these 9 steps, and I'll talk about sort of like some of the ones that I think are really like about the action. Because I think the first piece is really, the first stage is, we call it like belonging. And it's really about framing belonging in your family and attachment in your family, and, dealing with issues of like relational issues. The second phase is really about the kind of skill building that's really important in kids, that I think is definitely related to success and failure. So I think it's really helpful to have an understanding of your child's performance anxiety, especially because that can be a real sign of the fact that they're dealing with imposter syndrome and other things early on, is when they have a lot of doubts about their abilities to perform in certain environments. And so really having like tools to be able to face it and not be afraid of it, and not to say simple things like, just do it, or like, you're going to be fine, like dismissing the experience, but being present with them enough to know that it is coming from somewhere real. And we need to kind of be able to address it with them directly without being afraid of it. And we can reduce performance anxiety as parents. Yes, you can get a therapist, you can do all that stuff, but you can also, as a parent, help reduce their performance anxiety in a lot of ways. And attending to them becomes a part of that. And so I would also say, like, dealing with perfectionistic, like kind of behaviors that you see early on in childhood becomes super important too, about how do we, affect a child that looks like they're killing it because they're so perfectionistic, but it actually is detrimental to them and can long-term have really significant consequences. And understanding, like, a lot of perfectionism is about control, and like, what are they attempting to control, and how do we help them to see, like, the desire to control as not useful to them, and that there's a lot that can be out of their control and they can still be safe. And then also to dealing with failure and disappointment. So we want our kids to fail because we want them to learn how to build skills to actually deal with the failure, because nobody really succeeds in this life without having lots of failure. And so really learning like healthy ways to fail forward, and really even very much believe in, like, with my own children too, talking about the failures we're experiencing and how we're coping with those failures. And I let my kids witness moments in which we are failing, so that they can understand, like, it's recoverable and everyone fails. And I don't want them to see me as perfect and like beyond failure.
And I think also it's the meaning that we attach to the failure. And I feel like in my childhood, whether that was from my own home or from school system or whatever, I really felt like I attached this meaning of like who I was and my self-belief to my failure. And so the more failures that I made, the more I felt bad about myself. And I think of that now as like this idea of like shame resiliency. Like, how can I help model to my kids and also talk to my kids about, like, they don't have to attach meaning about themselves to their failures. Because then we're okay with failures. Then we just like rack it up like a video game. We're like, how many more like failures can we get? Right. Instead of, let me avoid failure at all costs, because if I fail, what does that mean about me as a human and as a person?
Yes. Yeah, totally. And that the failures, as long as you can learn from them and gain something from them, make you stronger. They don't make you weaker.
Mm-hmm.
They make you stronger. And like we talk about that in the first chapter about the difference between self-esteem and self-worth. So self-esteem being like, the ways in which you kind of feel confident about your skills or abilities or, competences versus like your self-worth, that you are worthy and valuable no matter what you're doing, who you are, what's going on, like you are worthy. And so I do think it's such an important thing to instill in kids that they are worthy and that the success, achievements, grades, that's not why they are loved. They are loved because they are who they are,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's nothing they need to like attain or achieve in order to feel that.
Yes.
That is definitely the message that I want my kids to have more than anything else. I am going to go buy your book. This sounds so fascinating. I love this whole idea and perspective. And I think that work you do is so valuable and so needed.
Thanks.
And so thank you. Thank you for like doing the really difficult thing of leaving that job. Like truly, like when you shared that story, I was like, oh, like that is painful and hard. And also led you to like exactly where you need to be in order to share this message. So thank you. Thank you for doing that and for being here to share it with everybody. Lastly, I'll just ask, where can people connect with you? Where can they get your book? What is the name of your third book, first of all?
Yes.
And we'll have the links in the show notes also to all of this, but if you can tell us all that.
Yeah. So the name of the third book is Your Child's Greatness, A Parent's Guide to Raising Children Without Imposter Syndrome. And you can find me on Instagram at Dr. Orbé-Austin. Richard's at Dr. Rich Orbé-Austin. I'm on Instagram and also LinkedIn very commonly. And at my website, you can find it at Dynamic Transitions LLP. And there's all kinds of information about there.com.
Okay, perfect. And for those of you that are like on your app and you can see this, I will have all the links to those in the show notes as well, and a link directly to her book so that you can go and get that. Thank you so much. Thank you for this conversation.
You're so welcome, Crystal. My pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, I would love for you to help spread the word by getting this message of support and guidance out to as many people as possible. So text it to your best friend or tag me on Instagram and share it. Leave a review, rate it, subscribe it, or follow on your favorite platform. Send me a DM on IG letting me know which parts have impacted you or what you'd like to see on future episodes. We'll see you next week.